ਜੀ ਆਇਆਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਅੱਜ ਜੁੜਨੇ ਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਕਾਲੀ ਰਾਏ ਆਪਾਂ ਆਏ ਹੋਏ ਹਾਂ ਸੈਕਰਾਮੈਂਟੋ ਸ਼ੈਰਿਫ ਦੇ ਆਫਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਕਾਟ ਜੋਨਸ ਅੱਜ ਤੋਂ 12 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਸੈਕਰਾਮੈਂਟੋ ਦੇ ਸ਼ੈਰਿਫ ਬਣੇ ਸੀ ਅਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਡਿਸੀਜਨ ਲਿਆ ਹੈਗਾ ਵੀ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 2022 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਨ ਕਰੇਗੇ ਪਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ 12 ਸਾਲ ਆਫਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਆ ਅਕੰਪਲਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿਆ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਲਈ ਸਰਵਿਸ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਆ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇਸੀ ਬਿਜ਼ਨਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਉਹ ਕਾਫੀ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਆਓ ਮਿਲੀਏ ਸਕਾਟ ਜੋਨਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ Scott Jones, Sheriff of Sacramento, welcome to our discussion. And I want to recognize that since 2010, we've known each other and your campaign for sheriff at that particular time. We had an engagement with the Indus Valley Chamber, and your opponent was there too. But following on from that, we've nearly completed 3 terms of your office tenure. And during these decade-plus years, you've been a very good friend and helper of the South Asian community, community at large, and the business community in particular. There have been occasions when we've come knocking on your door for advice, counsel, and help. So I want to appreciate that, and I want to thank you for how you have covered the needs of the community in service from your department. And from your perspective as 11 years as a sheriff of Sacramento, what do you believe the community has gained and what have you gained from the community?
Well, first I'd like to say that I appreciate the kind words, but it has not been one-sided. Your community has been a tremendous asset to me personally, but me as sheriff and to the department and to the women and men that work here as well. It has been a big learning curve. I think no matter who you are or how much experience, and I have had my whole career here in the sheriff's office, so I felt like I was fairly prepared to take over the office of sheriff, but I don't think anyone can truly prepare entirely. And so there was a tremendous learning curve to get in. One of the things I knew I wanted to do was engage the community better, specifically our young people. And so in the first few years, we created youth services, community relations unit, and business advisory boards. My background is my family's background is my father brought us to Sacramento to start his own business. And so the struggles of small business in particular, but also the recognition, the realization that small business drives economy, creates jobs, all of those things that are healthy for a society is very important. I knew I could play a role in that. And so we went to work, and I think over the last 12 years it's been trying for sure at times, but it's also been very rewarding in very real ways to see this department grow.
And that it has, and we've had some interaction with community perspectives of recruitment. And I believe during this tenure, and even before that, there were quite a few community members who were serving in the department. 2 of them are actually relatives of mine, Joe Rai and his brother. Yeah. You might have sort of known them during the time. They're both retired now. And then there's Joe Singh, who's one of my neighbors. So the department itself has diversity in representing the community. Most recently, there's been younger community members, and you and I have discussed when my son was exploring this. So I appreciate the help you gave at that time. But you also put us in contact with a member of your team who was out there liaising with community. So reaching out to the young people, that young man was ideal in the discussion that we had. It was very helpful, so much appreciated for your outreach efforts. On the community side of it, would you know how many South Asians work for the department?
Well, all of those, well, first of all, let me go back. Recruiting has always been difficult for law enforcement. It's a white, male-dominated profession. It always has been. Not because that's the way law enforcement agencies want it. It's just that is the folks that gravitate towards that career. But that told us we had to do something different, something better. And so we developed some very specific strategies early on to try and reach out to the underserved, what I call underrepresented groups, either ethnic or racial minorities or women. They're also underrepresented in law enforcement. We've had some great success. We are the most diverse department that I know anywhere in terms of trying to achieve the percentages as represented in the community within our ranks in the department. We've done very, very well in most cases there. So that community interaction is important. Part of that strategy is having folks that look like our community inside of our department. And not only that, but having folks see people that look like them in every aspect of our department. Right. So they can say, oh, I want to be a homicide detective. There's someone that looks like me who's a homicide detective. Exactly. I can achieve that. Or a sergeant, or a lieutenant, or a captain, or an undersheriff, depending on the group. So that's important. To me, there's no greater testament of faith than encouraging or allowing someone in your family, whether it's a child, a brother, whatever, a cousin, to come on our department. I love hearing stories about people whose family members are in our department, because that, right, to me, shows a tremendous amount of faith in our department that we will treat that person, especially underrepresented groups, with respect, and that they'll have opportunities that are limitless in this department.
True. When you mention percentages, one thing came to mind. I grew up in England, and they used to have what could be defined as a quota system. And India itself, as a nation, had devised this quota process for, again, the minorities, the underrepresented. The irony of India is that you're not a minority based on race, because the race generally is they're all Indians, but they have issues with their other discrimination process or prejudicial system, which is caste.
Sure.
So leaving that aside, they brought in a system of quotas for bringing up the lower caste or the economically challenged. The challenge to that was, if I was to come to you and tell you that you need to recruit 10%, and we've had this challenge for our educational system, that 10% of these people need to be brought in, or the argument nowadays, and it was brought in with the education legislative actions that were being taken, that we need to represent the community. So for argument's sake, we got 5% Asians.
Yeah.
Are you only going to bring in 5% Asians to your department, but you've got a pool of 20%?
No, absolutely not. So we've tried this. It's been tried at the state level for quotas, and I'm not a fan of that. I think it should be an interest of everyone, which is not to say I'm not interested in trying to get a representative department, but it should be organic, and we should do what we can to elevate the percentages naturally, organically, and qualifiedly, rather than trying artificially lower standards just to make the numbers look right. And we've shown in our department that we can do that. We don't need quotas. We can have goals, and we certainly do have goals, but we don't need quotas to do that, to accomplish that, and we've done very, very well. So to answer the other part of your question is, if Asians, for example, make up 5% of the population, would I stop at 5%? Once the goal's complete, mission accomplished, let's start hiring white males? Absolutely not. To me, honestly, this profession is colorblind. That's not entirely true, because I do want minority representation on our department, because that's the constituency we serve. Right. I want folks to be able to see people that look like them helping in those communities. So it's not colorblind in that sense, but it should be colorblind in terms of initial qualifications, merit, advancement within the department. You should not be limited by anything but your own effort and imagination when you're in the department, just like any business.
Right.
And so if 5% turns into 10%, turns into 20%, I'm all for it. Let's set the standards, and anyone that can achieve those standards and advance on their own merits, I'm all for, and I could care less whether they're white, Asian, black, red, or purple.
I totally agree with that, because personal experiences go back to the same arguments that were being brought up when they were trying to bring in these, not called quotas, but many of the Asian community were feeling attacked, because I think it's a process of the immigration process. The first generation comes in, they're more dedicated, they're more geared towards succeeding, and it may be specific to the Asian continent, but people like my parents came in and said, you got to hit the books.
Yeah.
Because education was one way up that ladder.
Yeah.
And for my dad, who used to work in a foundry casting metal engine parts, his only vision was to see that I ended up working in an air-conditioned office. He didn't care what it was. But his thing was, go hit the books.
Yeah.
And that way you won't have to go through what I go through. That determination of parents has carried through, but it feels that when we set these goals, then those hardworking individuals, children going through high school and then college, they get sort of like the so-called glass ceiling, not because they can't pass it, but because they're being held back. And that's really what those challenges are, and those people pushing for those, maybe they don't understand that side. But leaving that aside, we're looking at the reflection of the department. You and I had a discussion some years back on Sikhs in their sort of attire.
Yes.
Have we crossed that bridge yet?
We haven't. We've found the bridge, and we're on the bridge, but we haven't crossed that bridge. At that time, I think when you and I first talked, there was one department, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, that had developed policy and was going down that road. And so I was very interested to see how that would work, and see what process they went through. It's, the law enforcement's great for plagiarizing and stealing best practices from everybody else. So if someone else can go through the work and the pain and the effort and the challenges, and I can take advantage of all that and just meet them at the finish line, so much the better. So that was my intention, and I actually went down to LA. I actually went down there and talked to the sheriff, who at that time was Jim McDonnell, and got a copy of their policy and was kind of waiting. So as it turned out, they never implemented it. They saw, at least they perceived, that it had too many complications, that it was going to be impossible for them to implement. So that honestly kind of cooled my ability to go forward based on their research. I would have had to start at ground zero. I do know that, like the RCMP and some of the other premier law enforcement agencies, have allowed that.
Right.
And so it is not something, it's not something I've given up on, for sure. But I will, I have to take ownership that I've dragged my feet on it, for sure. It is something that I've been very interested in doing. I'd love to be the first in California, but I also have to be mindful of some of the stumbling blocks that led other folks to start down that road and not finish either. So I guess it's a work in progress.
Now that you're bringing in the policies within the sheriff's departments in California, are they any different from policies with other states?
In terms of?
Texas? Would the sheriff in Texas have a different hiring policy, uniform policy, than what the California sheriffs might?
So the policies in the departments are agency specific. So my policy has nothing to do, for uniform grooming standards, things like that, would have nothing to do with Stockton Police Department. Okay. So we could do our own. I think historically what has happened is, and the courts have upheld, a uniform grooming standard, right? So ceremonial headdress, turbans, facial hair for religious practices, those are the things that have been challenged throughout time. Agencies historically have said, look, we don't want to go down this road, right? Because then what is, if we hire a Hasidic Jew, all of these different cultural, ethnic, religious variances to the uniform grooming standard would be a road that, a bit of a Pandora's box in some respects. And so I think historically law enforcement agencies have been pretty hesitant to actually start down that road, because that road is long. And those have been challenged in the courts. The courts have repeatedly upheld that law enforcement agencies can enforce a uniform grooming standard because we serve everybody. It's important for all of us to be the same, represent everybody, and not represent any individual. We shouldn't have any individuality as officers. We should represent the entire community. And I think law enforcement agencies have rested on that, saying, "Oh, we can have this uniform grooming standard where the law protects us and we're good." But that's really only half of the discussion, right? So, one of my mantras is just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do a thing.
Right.
And I think we as law enforcement, but certainly as a community, have evolved over time. And so I think really the timing to start looking at this. Okay, so yeah, I can say no. I can say no, and the law backs me up, and I can feel pretty strong about that. But even though I can say no, why? What are the problems? Okay, we have to fit people with face masks. Okay, well, what if we can get around that, which we can, for emergency breathing apparatus? What if we can get around that, which I think now we can? What if, is it really going to have a detrimental effect on the public to see someone in a turban that's an officer? I just think we're past that as a society. So I think many people rely on that because they don't want to start going down that road because they don't know where that road will lead. There's a little bit of fear there. But I think we're also, community-wise and law enforcement-wise, being responsive to our communities, I think we're at a place that those discussions are reasonable to have.
True. I asked the Texas question because Sandeep Dhaliwal, who was shot in the line of duty doing a traffic stop, he was one of the first turban Sikh deputies, being in Texas, Houston area. The reason I brought that thing up was Sandeep Dhaliwal, who was a deputy in Texas, Houston. He lost his life in the line of duty. He was the first deputy turban Sikh attire, and many in the community feel that did open the doors. And then we had in New Jersey and the AG, who's just now gone to work for the SEC. So when it comes to exposure as Sikhs, we have Colonel Khalsi, we have a few others, and the French defense minister. So there is exposure, there is recognition. In the case of the Canadian defense minister, he served both in the Canadian military and in the Vancouver police area. So his universal skills in both fields were very valuable, at least in the arena of the area we're just now evacuating, Afghanistan. So from a attire side, it seems to somebody like me, a novice, why is there a problem with it?
Yeah.
But then I'm reading today that the British, who ruled over India for 200 years, and they had Sikhs in their military. So why would the British not know about Sikhs? Is a really mysterious question for me. But today I'm reading that they've actually come up with a uniform code for Sikhs in the British Navy, the British Air Force, and the British Army. So if it takes them that long to decide that they can have Sikhs serving in their uniformed services, is it really a big question if it doesn't happen here? But you said you're on the bridge, so yeah.
I'm definitely on the bridge.
To back up Sandeep Dhaliwal and the work he was doing, I think we as a community would be embracing, that wholeheartedly, because that's one of the things that sort of creates that beneficial sort of achievement status that sort of, yes, something has been achieved.
Well, so I've got a little over a year left. Let me see what I can do before I get out of here.
Okay. The current situation of the nation, I mean, you've got a year left, and we'll address that a little later, but we've gone through this pandemic. And in this pandemic, we've had a lot of issues related to the mandates or the stipulations or the emergencies that are being declared, not just in California, but across the nation. Right now, we're going through this Delta phase. We were going through these phases where our ex-President 45 was being attributed to with these various labels of attacks of racism because he was relating the origin of the virus to the virus. And then we came up with other variants, the Brazilian, the South African, and stuff like that. And there's talk that this so-called Delta virus might have come from India, but this labeling and identifying appears to have gone to now call it the Delta and the Theta and all that stuff. So maybe that'll be neutral. But coming back on this mandates and everything else and the universal need to serve the community, where would your department stand on enforcing the mask mandate that now is for vaccinated and unvaccinated? So if I'm at a grocery store and the clerk calls your officers, what can I expect? Handcuffs or?
Absolutely not. From the very first days of this, I've been pretty resolute and very consistent that our department, the deputies, are not going to be enforcing. Originally, it was stay-at-home orders. Originally, it was group size. It's then mask mandates. It's now everything that we wouldn't be enforcing that. A couple of practical reasons. Some personal. I don't necessarily agree with them. I think we are going as a society. People are being asked. Actually, they're not even being asked anymore. They're being forced to give up their freedoms, their right to choose, their right to decide what their own medical treatment's going to be between them and their doctor. That's the personal side. But the professional side is more pragmatic, I think. Number one is we don't have additional staffing. We still have all the same work we have to do. So I don't have additional staffing to enforce this stuff. But beyond that, I'm not sure I have the legal justification to do it. I'm also a lawyer, as you know, and I have a background in constitutional law to go along with the many oaths I've taken to uphold the Constitution. And for our business, that means doing law enforcement actions based on probable cause, upon reasonable suspicion. These are well-vetted constitutional concepts that allow us to then take action. And some county health officer, some administrator at California Office of Health, at CDC or NIH at the federal level, that's not creating law. And them saying that there's probable cause for me to arrest somebody for violating it doesn't mean there's probable cause. And I don't want to put my officers in the position of having to enforce something like that. But beyond that, let's take it to its natural progression. If in that instance where we're called to a supermarket to enforce that and the person refuses to put on a mask, what level of force is appropriate for us to use in that instance? Are we supposed to take that person into custody, book them into jail? Are we supposed to determine, like in the early days, whether their trip to the store was essential or non-essential? And how much investigative resources are we supposed to use to make sure? But what level of force? Can we twist the person up if they still resist? Can we use a taser? Can it escalate into a deadly force situation because someone's not willing to wear their mask? No, that's not what we are supposed to do and not what we should be doing. At the end of the day, I want people to call us if they're having an issue and know that we're going to show up and make their situation better, or at least not make it worse. And that is the exact opposite. If we've seen anything over the last year of social justice protests, we've seen that people want law enforcement to be more responsive to their community, do no harm. And this is the antithesis of that. This is absolutely contrary to showing up and doing no harm. There's no way to show up at a restaurant and make an arrest or close down a business that looks good. There's no way to do that. And so I'm just not going to be a part of it. That's not to say the county health people or the state officers won't come in and do it, but my folks aren't going to be a part of it.
Okay, well, appreciate that. And related to that, sticking within the last window of the 16, 17 months, we had one situation that occurred in Minnesota with George Floyd. Tragic as it is, any loss of life is tragic. I have my personal issues on history of crime and all that stuff, but leaving those aside, you've had the discussion with me also in the past when you've told me that, hey, we recruit from the community, and the community has bad apples, and we'll pick up some of those bad apples regardless of the amount of vetting we do. And when you find those bad apples, you discard them. And there's been cases not only in Sacramento but around the nation. From that perspective, we understand that sort of when you've done a crime, justice should be fair for all. But the spin-off from this was not what this officer did. It came out to be defund the police. The defund the police, I believe, over the time has evolved. But the original impression I got, they're going to take your money away, they're going to make you fire everybody, and we're going to have no law enforcement services. And I think these people who are pushing that, they realize that too. So then they started putting in, oh no, we don't want to do that. We just want to have them redirect resources. So their scenario is, me and my spouse get into a little tussle, and your people are called. And now, compared to what it would have been, your deputies would have shown up, there would have been a male officer there and a female officer there, and they would probably have divided and had a discussion and then made a call. Mm-hmm. Do we take one of them away, or do we do what? All this other stuff. Not that me and her would get any violent or anything like that, other than disagreeing why somebody, whatever. But in their cases, we've had them in Sacramento where deputies have gone by and it's been a violent situation. I believe there was one a few years back in North Sacramento. In that situation, would you agree that a social worker from the Sacramento Social Services or a social worker in your department would be ideal to accompany or go attend a domestic violence situation?
So let me go back. There was a lot in that question. So if we go back to last summer after George Floyd, after Memorial Day of last year, and everything that ensued, and the rise of Black Lives Matter, for example. And I was saying back then, and it's just as true today, there's really two parts of Black Lives Matter. There's Black Lives Matter, the statement, and I think we can all agree with that. It's a intrinsically true statement. But there's also Black Lives Matter, the political movement, which is what we saw creating all the destruction, trying to erase history, and so on and so forth. You mentioned that the defund the police movement has morphed a little bit into, well, we just want to reimagine the police, want to redirect resources. But make no mistake about it, that's the media doing that. The media understands that nobody wants to defund the police, so they've tried to mitigate the effects of what Black Lives Matter and other similar groups, anarchist groups or anti-society groups, whatever you want to call them, George Soros groups, Antifa, they've tried to mitigate that. BLM Sacramento is, by their own statements, an abolitionist group. They don't want better police. They want no police. That's generally true of BLM around the country. It's only the media that says, well, when they say that, they really mean this, to make it more palatable for the public. And so you still have a huge segment of activists that are calling for defunding, which is literally, as it sounds, defunding and eliminating the police. To the question of, can we do things better? Is there different ways we can arrive at the same old problems? Absolutely, yes. I can tell you that law enforcement becomes basically the master of all trades, the jack of all trades. We have to solve everybody's problem. If there's a cat stuck in a tree, if there's the garbage problem, we're the only office open 24 hours a day, and we get called for everything. And as other services shut down, a perfect example is mental health in California. As that infrastructure shuts down, guess what that goes to? We have to become the de facto experts in mental health and how to respond to that. And we do. That's what we do. We adapt and we overcome and we train and we become better at it. And right now we have, in the mental health side, CIT teams, right? So we have folks that go out with social workers. And if the call is appropriate, we have an officer paired up with a clinician to go out and try and have a non-law enforcement resolution to a mental health crisis. It has been wildly successful. We've also internally trained our officers to differentiate among different mental illnesses and have a different response to each. It used to be, okay, there's a mental health history, we keep our distance, we speak slower, but now we know there's different mental health diagnoses that necessitate a different response. We've trained our dispatchers to be able to ask pertinent questions for officer safety and subject safety. And I got to say that while we had a lot of negative outcomes in the past, some of which were highly public, we've had extremely few negative outcomes, violent outcomes since these times in the last several years. And it's because of that. So to go on to your hypothetical about if you're having marital discord, which if it led to some violence, there's laws against that. There's not much we can do if there's violence involved. We're going to take somebody to jail. But if there's not, if we're in the beginning phase, if there's an opportunity to intervene to keep it from going down that road, would let's say a family or marriage counselor paired up with an officer be an appropriate person to drop off there, handle that situation? I think that's very possible, but it's not limited to that. I think that is possible for all of these things. But that's not replacing the police. Right. That's figuring out a way to be force multipliers and make the police better. I was very open when I talked to the Board of Supervisors when you had two of them calling for defunding when it was popular to do so. And I said, look, I'm all for figuring out better ways to go to mental health calls. I'm all for it. But don't start by taking money from the sheriff's office. Work with the sheriff's office. We're the experts. Work with us and figure out a better way. And if, by the way, if that ends up in requiring less calls for service, requiring fewer officers for me, I'll happily give up that money. And that's what defunding should be. It should be a deliberate strategy to figure out how we can do things better. And then as it reduces the demand for law enforcement, the need for it, then we can repurpose some of that money for some of those programs that are successful and evidence-based. And so that's really, if I were talking about defunding, my discussion would go towards that. But and the media would like to soften it. But the reality is you've still got the same political forces that are at play that want to get rid of all police. People don't want that. Even the groups that these folks, even BLM, that they purport to represent, there's a nationwide poll that says they've interviewed 83% of African Americans want the same or higher level of police in their communities, right, not less. And so who do they represent? They don't represent anybody, yet this media has this fascination and put them as the lead story on the news every night as if they somehow represent someone, and they don't. Right. They only represent their own political interests.
Well, thank you on that, and it was quite detailed and quite explanatory, at least, on how you would consider defunding the police and the source of the mutation on that call is very relevant. But in the interest of time, you said in our earlier discussion that you've got 1 year plus a few months.
Yes.
So looking ahead to the department, you have been very successful in the last decade or plus of building it and bringing it here. But life carries on. You may turn out to be a civilian who will call on your own department one day in the future because you're either driving somewhere or something. We never know when those interactions are going to occur.
Right.
But what would be your vision for 10 years after you, the ex-sheriff of Sacramento?
It's hard to say. I mean, I've been with this department my entire life, 32 years and running. I will have spent over a third of my career as sheriff by the time I retire. And I had my own vision coming into this office. Now, fortunately, I've gotten to do everything that I've wanted to do. All the large initiatives that I've wanted to do, I've done. There's other things that I would like to accomplish, but some of the large initiatives I'd like to get done. So when you ask me, what's my vision for 10 years? It really isn't about my vision. What I want is for someone with the same depth of passion, vision, energy that I came in with in 2010 to step into this office and have their own vision. And I'm very excited about that. There's a certain amount of, oh gosh, I'm letting go of the reins. I'm walking out of this office. I'm boxing up my stuff. And now it's out of my control what happens at this department. And obviously I'm very vested in the future of this department. But the other part of that is absolute excitement because someone's vision is not going to be the same as my vision. It's going to be different. But it's not going to be any less valid than the visions I came in here with 11 years ago. And so I don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. I'm excited because I want someone, it's time for me to go. part of that knowing it's time for me to go is because I am very excited about someone else coming in with their own vision. I mean, I could stay. I mean, I could have this job as long as I wanted, honestly. I mean, just to be honest, I think we provide a great service. I think that the public has been very supportive. They had a well-funded candidate against me last time, better funded than I, and I won by 30% in the primary. I really feel like I could, but that's not doing this department or this community any service. The best thing I can do for this department for 10 years from now is leave and let somebody else come in. So that's the part I'm very excited about.
Well, that's very visionary in a way, because it's recognizing that sort of a change can come with new leadership. The other side of your role as sheriff and partnerships with the DA, with the state level, and even with the law enforcement agencies within the cities of Sacramento, or even partner agencies across the state, how have they evolved with your involvement? I believe you were president of one of the associations.
I was president of the California Peace Officers Association, and active in the State Sheriff's Association, obviously. And when I first took this job, I always say I was a cop by choice and a politician by force, because I had to be a politician to get this job. And my desire in the beginning was to stay out of politics. I didn't want any part of it. I just wanted to be the sheriff and run my department. Well, I learned very, very quickly that you can't separate the two. And so, I used this platform and this pulpit that I had to speak on issues of public safety, speak out against bills that were bad for public safety, these types of things. In so doing, largely unintentionally, I did develop these relationships. I have great relationships with all the cities within Sacramento County. I have relationships at the national level. You can see some of the pictures back here. I've got pictures with President Trump. I've got pictures with President Biden. I've been invited to the White House twice. I've testified in front of Congress. It has been an amazing journey that I never could have envisioned. And that was nothing I ever set out to do. It's something that opening myself up to the full potential of this position has led me on this journey. And that takes time. It takes effort and it takes time. And I'd say for the first 2 or 3 years of this job, I felt like a guy trying to swim without a life preserver. It was amazingly difficult. And then over the last couple of years, I'm like, okay, well, I've got it all figured out. This is comfortable now. It's comfortable. And then COVID hit, and then some of the social justice challenges hit, and I thought, okay, it's interesting again, but it's a little too interesting now. So let's go back to being comfortable. And so hopefully this next year will bring a little comfort. I can transition into retirement. But the interesting part about Sacramento County, there's a couple of things. Number one is I didn't realize what a big voice I would have, being the capital seat of California that everybody watches to. I'm amazed. No matter where I go in the country, I have people that know me and follow me on Facebook, other law enforcement leaders. I have people that I get messages back, hey, my chief said to tell you this or that. That always shocks me. I mean, it always surprises me to this day. But that's the power of the office of sheriff, and that's the power of the office of the Sacramento County Sheriff. So I respect it, I revere it, I don't take it lightly. And I'm certain the next sheriff will grow into that as well.
Well, thank you, Scott. And I know in the interest of time, you've got other things to do. You're a busy person. But on the last comment you made, what's your thoughts on the next sheriff? Is there anybody you would like to fill your shoes?
There is. And I have to go back. And it's not just someone that can do a good job, because that's where I was last year. It was my intention to only run 2 terms. At the end of the day, and before the filing deadline, there was no one that I felt comfortable with that could do it. And part of that was my failure, because that's part of my job, is to cultivate the next era of leadership. That's why I jumped in. That's why I had to run and do this 3rd term. But during that time, I've seen tremendous growth and leadership develop in one of my employees, and that employee is Jim Barnes. He's one of my chief deputies. He is extremely intelligent. He's dedicated. He's been out in the community much more than I was when I ran. And, I see something in him that I sometimes forget forget that I had in 2010, which is that fire to run, that passion to serve, and that passion to lead. I just can't say enough about him. He will be an outstanding sheriff, and I would have no trouble leaving the department to him and watching his trajectory of this department take us even further.
Well, thank you on that, and we'll look forward to talking to Jim on that one. The 210 battle that you had in your election cycle was pretty rough. Can we expect anything similar where Jim might need extra forces in the back?
Well, I think that's definitely true. I mean, the sheriff is unique because everybody needs the sheriff. Everybody identifies with their sheriff. It's public safety. So you have Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs. Personal safety is right there at the bottom. So before you care about whatever your issue is, climate change, family rights, whatever it is, you have to feel safe coming out of your house. So sheriff means something to everybody. And so the public generally gets involved. And so helping get the word out, obviously there's not going to be a lot of commercials. There's not enough money for commercials and all those things to inundate the airwaves. But I know he's going out talking to groups, and those people are talking to people. And that's what all politics are local, and there's nothing more local than the sheriff's race. So he's definitely going to need some help, but he's putting in the work as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you on that, Scott Jones, Sheriff of Sacramento. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate all you've done for Sacramento and the community. And on behalf of the South Asian community, a special thank you for everything during the last 11 years. We hope to repeat this to you a year down the road when you're actually packed the box. But until then, enjoy, and hopefully everybody's safe, and you'll keep a watch over everybody.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your friendship.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.